Fantastic. Okay, thanks so much for having me, guys. I'm really excited to be hanging out with you. Before I get into my presentation today, I'd like to acknowledge that the Remington Carriage Museum operates in the Treaty 7 region on the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy and the traditional territory of Métis Region Number 3. So, my name is Ashley Hardwick, and I am the lucky curator who gets to work with the collection here at the Remington Carriage Museum in Cardston, Alberta. We are located in the southern region of Alberta, which is, approximately 24 kilometers north of the US border. Or if you're flying into one of our major city centers here in Alberta, we are roughly 235 kilometers south of Calgary. Our collection features over 300 horse-drawn vehicles, ranging from commercial and industrial vehicles to privately owned vehicles and just about everything in between. What I would like to discuss during today's talk today is the widespread integral roles that horse-drawn transportation played in our society before the popularity of motor vehicles. In order to do that, we have to consider four important facets. These include function, design, communication, and impact on contemporary vehicles. Now, I'm sure there's some of you who are wondering what I mean by function. Maybe you're thinking, what about function? It gets from point A to point B, and you're absolutely correct. Transportation is, at its very core, about moving from point A to point B. But, and I'm sure it's the same for motor vehicles, there's so much more to the function of a carriage than just where it's been and where it's going. The next point I'd like to talk about is diversity, but this is probably a pretty good place to make a note about terminology. If I could describe horse-drawn transportation with a single word, it would be diverse. One of the most challenging lessons that I had when I started at the Remington was terminology, simply because there's so much of it. In a general sense, I mean, you've got things like carriages and buggies and wagons, but then you've got all the different types of those. Vis-a-vis Phaeton, Landau, Dray, Sulky, Brougham, coal box buggy, piano box buggy, California cart. I could go on, but then we'd be here literally all night. One of my favorite books that I reference quite often is called Carriage Terminology, a historical history by Don H. Berkebile, and it alone has like 300 pages dedicated to defining and cross-referencing different types of carriages and horse-drawn vehicles. The point that I'm trying to make here is that to save myself from saying horse-drawn transportation a potentially unreasonable number of times over the next hour or so, I may use the word carriage in a more general sense at some point. If you have any questions about the different types of vehicles, I'll do my best to answer at the end of the talk, or please feel free to email me directly if you have a question. My email will be on the end of the slides as well. Okay, so horse-drawn transportation is diverse because society itself has diverse needs. Humans use transportation for so many different things. Work, play, for ourselves, our families, our friends. I'd like you to think about how you would transport something like an 8-foot-long 2x4 from Home Depot to your house. You wouldn't go pick it up in a smart car, right? It'd be like way too small. Be hilarious, probably, but not effective. But you also wouldn't take something like a stretch limo either, because even if you could strap it to the roof, it would just be strange. Very strange. You'd likely use a truck or a vehicle, something like that, either your own or maybe you would rent one, because that's what those vehicles are for. They're designed to have cargo space, even at the cost of passenger capacity. The kind of vehicle that you choose depends on your intention. And who was the vehicle intended to move? What was it intended to move? When was it intended to move, and where was it intended to go? This is what makes that basic point A to point B movement so diverse. And that's just as true for carriages. The bull cart on the left was used to transport cargo from Fort Benton in the United States to the Northwest Mounted Police in Fort Macleod here in the Canadian prairies. it is necessarily going to look very different from the racing vehicle pictured beside it. The roles that these two vehicles are intended to fulfill are very different, and they would probably struggle to fulfill each other's purposes. Although sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have that many bull carts racing, but that's just me. The purposes and functions of vehicles were sometimes very broad, such as the season. Sleighs were a lot easier to use in the wintertime, for example, than a wheeled vehicle. But sometimes it was also more nuanced than that, and that's where design really comes into play. It gets hard to discuss function without also discussing design, because in many ways they're pretty closely interlinked. Design often reflected the function of a horse-drawn vehicle. Continuing the seasonal example, the difference between a carriage intended for wintertime use and a carriage designed for summertime use is the presence of runners or wheels. That's pretty easy, right? Broad design solution for a broad intended use. As the function and intention of a horse-drawn vehicle became more specialized, though, so too could the design. Here's a couple of vehicles that we have on display right now that I like to use to illustrate this. So the vehicle on the right is called a light dray. It was popular for construction and industrial work, and it's a pretty generalized vehicle. You can use it to carry packs of shingles or barrels, like the props that we have on display with it. Or you could use it to carry other things, like lighter kinds of machinery. The rails are removable and the deck is flat. There's nothing particularly specialized about it except for maybe the removable rails. As a fun fact, this specific dray was owned by Don Remington, for whom our museum is named after. Apparently his family also used it as a table during summer barbecues as well, so it's had quite a few uses in its lifetime. In contrast, though, the vehicle pictured in the middle and on the left is a dump wagon. Through a series of chains controlled with a lever, the underside of this wagon opens and closes to drop its load to the surface below. Dump wagons were often used by farmers, but could also be used for construction and industrial purposes like the dray. I can tell you that most wagons and carriages don't have bottoms that can open up like this on purpose. This vehicle has a very specialized design intended to perform this very specific function. Due to this design, you'd probably have a pretty hard time moving construction equipment in it, and you would definitely have a hard time to having a picnic on it. Yes, as a side note, yes, you could probably use the dray to move some rocks. That's the beauty of a general use vehicle. But the efficiency would suffer. You limit the number and size of rocks that you'd be able to carry, and you'd increase the necessary man hours for the job, because then you'd need to get the rocks off the dray by hand. This is a fairly large example of difference in design, but some specializations were more aesthetic than they were mechanical, like for advertising. This is one of my favorite illustrations. I wish we had one of these in our collection. This is a cigar delivery wagon, and its special feature has nothing to do with increasing the physical efficiency of delivering the cigars. It was intended to be seen and to spread information of the company's wares. It was meant for attracting attention and disseminating information effectively. So far, we've looked at examples that have revolved around commercial or industrial uses, but diversity, intention, and design, they all had roles to play with private carriages as well. So let's go ahead and compare a California cart to a George IV Phaeton, both of which are owner-driven. So this is a California cart. They were particularly popular vehicles in Alberta due to their versatility. They could be used to carry equipment or people. One of the first ways that it was actually explained to me was that a rancher could throw some fence pickets and other supplies in the cart to mend a fence, and then drive with his wife into town when he was done. On the other hand, a George IV Phaeton, what makes this special is the wider openings on the sides, the low and easily accessible steps. As the story goes, the original design for this carriage was drawn because as King George IV got older, and perhaps a little heavier, he needed a carriage that was easier for him to enter and more comfortable for him to sit in. And perhaps that alone is enough to be considered specialized. But eventually they also became really popular with ladies of a higher social standing because of all the room for petticoats and bustles. And apparently the wider sides made it a lot easier to show off your outfit as well. And therefore your social class. But carriage's symbolism and social class is something I'd like to touch down on a little bit later. So some specializations are large, and we've explored a few carriages that have fairly drastic features. The most specialized horse-drawn vehicle that I'm aware of, though, is the Red River cart. This might be something many of you have seen before. The one that I have up on the screen right now is a replica that was produced by our restoration shop here at the Remington. These are a Métis vehicle that are pretty strongly associated with Manitoba these days. But what makes it so special beyond that history is its construction. Traditionally, these carts are completely made out of wood, and usually some sort of sinew or leather. The ones that I've seen and worked with have this textile-esque material commonly wrapped around the wheels. This would give it a little bit more reinforcement. Being entirely made out of wood meant that these vehicles were ideal for traveling in areas that would have lacked a blacksmith or other metal workers, because it meant that repairs could be made without them. So if the pin keeping the wheel on the hub broke, you could whittle down a new one. Did one of your spokes snap or a felloe became damaged? With a little bit of skill and time, you could use the trees around you to make those repairs. Now, that being said, these are not the most luxurious vehicles in the world. There's not much in the way of shock absorption, and these carts are very, very loud. This is a wooden hub rubbing directly on a wooden axle. They make a very loud, grating, squealing noise when they're moved, I can attest. Most of these specializations that we've looked at were not always so drastic. So some of them were fairly small, like this Yellowstone coach. She is big, she is beautiful, and she was meant for transporting tourists around Yellowstone Park. The specialization she shares with other larger vehicles and some more luxurious vehicles, I suppose. She has leather thoroughbred suspension. So basic springs absorb movement in a vertical direction, right? Leaf springs, elliptical springs, just to name a few. What makes leather thoroughbraces different is that the body is essentially suspended over the gear. So not only does it go this way, but it can also go horizontally. To an extent, these things aren't like, they're not swings, right? You're not going to get thrown out one way or another. The close-up photos on either side show a little bit more detail of what these would have looked like. Layers upon layers upon layers of leather pressed together and sturdy enough to withstand a lot of weight and jostling. In the case of this specific vehicle, it definitely would have helped to make that ride a little more comfortable. It wouldn't have been the smoothest because of the terrain that it was driven in, Yellowstone Park, but it would have been better than just leaf springs for sure. There's another vehicle in our collection. It's called an 8-spring barouche, and it's a fancier vehicle. It also belonged to Don Remington. It has a combination of 3 different types of springs. So the thoroughbraces, like the ones you see on the screen, were suspended from 4 large C springs, which in turn each sat on its own elliptical spring. In his oral history, Mr. Remington says that because of that, it is a beautiful floating ride. It's actually just plain beautiful too. So the extant vehicles that we've looked at so far demonstrate that horse-drawn transportation was used pretty extensively and for a variety of tasks that span from household and private use to public and commercial use. But more than just functional tools, carriages were also a means of communication. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines communication as a process through which information is exchanged between individuals through a common system of symbols, signs, and behavior. What this means for the purposes of our context is that carriages, or the lack thereof, were a common way that people implied information about themselves or inferred information about others. This is true even today, though perhaps in a little bit more of a limited way. Today, riding in a carriage or a sleigh, it's a novelty. It's used usually for a special occasion. Efficiency is traded for the impact or for the experience. The Gold State Coach is a somewhat recent example, reserved for the most special of occasions. This is the coach that has been used by British monarchs for their coronation since 1831. King Charles III was included just this past year. This coach is notoriously uncomfortable to ride in, and yet it has been used for generations, even though cars are arguably more efficient and more comfortable. Why? Why is this still used? Because it's an iconic carriage. It communicates tradition, royalty, and even power to some extent. It is a symbol of the monarchy itself. If this carriage is being used, bystanders know that something is very important involving the monarchy is occurring. Moving away from more famous carriages like the Gold State Coach, though, horse-drawn vehicles were also representative in the early 20th century. Jane Austen famously incorporates vehicles as communication tools in her novels, such as in these two Pride and Prejudice quotes. "Why, my dear, you must know, Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately. And if he had been so very agreeable, he would have talked to Mrs. Long, but I can guess how it was. Everybody says that he is eat up with pride, and I dare say he had somehow heard that Mrs. Long does not keep a carriage, and had to come to the ball in a hack chaise." Both of these quotes are spoken by Mrs. Bennet, who apparently runs the gossip mill, which is, lucky for us in this case, because there are a couple important things to note in these quotes. Starting with the first one, there's a distinct relationship made here between the young man's large fortune and the chaise and four. A chaise and four means basically is that the vehicle he was traveling in was pulled by four horses, or capable of being pulled by four horses. Horse-drawn transportation may have been a staple at the turn of the century, but that didn't make it cheap. Horses cost a lot of money. They need to be fed, cared for daily, nursed with sick, and so on. Unlike cars, which, hopefully only need maintenance a few times a year instead of days, and they run on gasoline. Well, you know what? I'm not sure what the gas prices in Ontario are like right now, but if they're anything like the ones in Alberta, maybe there might not be that much of a cost difference, but anyways, the point I'm trying to make here is that Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Long are inferring wealth partially due to the fact that this man's carriage was pulled by four horses, which would have taken more capital and more resources to maintain properly. In regards to the second quote, Mrs. Bennet, again the soul of gossip, is speculating on Mr. Darcy's coldness to Mrs. Long. Another important terminology point here, when she mentions the hack chaise, what she means is that it was rented. Hack generally means hired. So she's contributing his lack of conversation to the fact that Mrs. Long does not have her own carriage and had to rent one for the evening, and that he's basically too stuck up to interact with her because his perceptions of her family's lack of wealth. So when we contrast these two excerpts together, it paints a portrait of inferences. Having no carriage of your own is perceived as a lack of fortune, something that can be snubbed. Yet having a carriage that is capable of being pulled by four horses, and that you actually have four horses to pull it, is on the opposite end of the spectrum. If you have that many horses and you can keep them in good health, it's an indication of the resources that you have. As an academic point, yes, Pride and Prejudice is a fictional novel, but it's not fantasy fiction, and it does tend to reflect common societal norms. As a more historical example, Don Remington did acknowledge this pattern of inference in an oral history regarding one of the part formal sleighs that we have in our collection. He says, "It seems that it was a rather fashionable thing to do during the summer months to try and improve your turnout each year. So when winter came and the first snowfall came, you could turn out a little better outfit than the Joneses next to you. So people strived for excellence. They would try and get a better sleigh or a better cutter, a better harness, a better pair of horses to drive." From a scholarly perspective, extant vehicles communicate a lot about the time period in which they were used, even on a wider scale than personal representation. One such example includes vehicles that I'm sure most of us are familiar with that arose during the economic crisis of the Great Depression. Bennett buggies, or Hoover wagons, depending on whether or not you were in Canada or the United States, were a product of necessity. With the cost of gasoline becoming unaffordable and household incomes diving dramatically, many people were unable to maintain or just plain unable to use their automobiles. Regardless of that situation, though, people still needed a mode of transportation to fulfill the roles that their automobiles had been doing. So a lot of people took a half step backwards. They used their horses to drive their automobiles. As home-built carriages, these kinds of vehicles, they really varied in what they looked like. The more iconic ones had very little done to the automobile structure except to remove some tricky or bulky pieces. The one in the photo there actually looks like they may have removed part of the front of the vehicle to make room for the shafts. But, others ended up looking more like their predecessors at the first glance, where a box or a similar piece would just be situated on top of the automobile's gears and tires. I think it's fairly safe to say that the people retrofitting these vehicles, Frankensteining them, if you will, probably didn't do this because of fashion or because of a trend. They wouldn't have essentially deconstructed the car they paid good money for without a very good reason. They did it because horse-drawn transportation was a more economically sustainable option for them at a time when the economy in general was in crisis. The existence of vehicles like these Bennett buggies and Hoover wagons, they're really evidence of such a situation, communicating to us now the financial difficulties of that time period. Extant vehicles like these demonstrate that they were used for all sorts of goals, even beyond the physical ones, like moving from point A to point B. They're used as tools of communication and representation by their owners, with the intention of implying knowledge about them themselves, I should say, not the carriages, the people. But they're also academic tools of a wider representation that are useful today to gain insights into how Canadian society functioned in these historical situations. So for the majority of the talk so far, I've kind of touched down on what carriages were used for, both as an object and a symbol, and what they looked like. But there's more to carriages than just being historically interesting. They're also extremely pertinent to consider when looking at their equivalencies today, because there are impacts that we live with today that were rooted in the past. I guess you could say they really have an element of foreshadow of what kinds of vehicles society could make as we advanced. That being said, I'd like to take a few moments to discuss some of the carriage manufacturers that made these vehicles and how they evolved, or didn't, with the arrival of automobiles. So I could probably have a presentation on carriage manufacturers all by itself. Canada had quite a few notable manufacturers, and many of these were in Ontario alone. The McLaughlin Carriage Company, which was based out of Oshawa, is probably the first one that I should mention because it shares a city with my incredible hosts this evening. The Remington also currently has an exhibit on the McLaughlin Carriage Company and the McLaughlin family. So I won't be saying too much about them tonight, but I do know that there was a past talk on the McLaughlin patriarch's death that was hosted in this series a little while ago. If you guys are interested, go take a look. Anyways, yes, the McLaughlins were a very large name in the Canadian carriage manufacturer history, but there were more. J.B. Tudhope, who ran the Tudhope Carriage Company out of Orillia, formed a large conglomerate by absorbing several other manufacturers in the early 20th century. Waterous Engine Works Company was another big name, but more diverse. In addition to horse-drawn firefighting vehicles, they also manufactured things like tools. The Convoy Carriage Company out of Toronto was a family business with a particularly interesting claim to fame. They were one of the first manufacturers outside of Britain to build a body for Rolls-Royce. In 1914, that cost about $13,000. Unfortunately, I don't have the inflation for that and what the equivalency would have been now, but I'm willing to guess it's quite a bit. Then there's, the Monroe and McIntosh Carriage Works with their iconic slogan, the buggy from Glengarry. This company was an icon for their region at that time and was recognized and celebrated with a plaque as early as 2011. In 1902, it was reported that their factory could produce a carriage in 21 minutes, which is amazing. Some of these companies even attempted to jump on the automobile bandwagon. Please pardon the pun. I didn't realize it till just now, but please pardon. Unfortunately, though, not all of these companies survived the new horseless carriage era. William Gray and Sons out of Chatham worked with a Michigan company owned by Josiah Dallas Dort to form Gray Dort Motors Limited. And they were good. They were very good. In Canada, they were one of Ford's competitors. Unfortunately, though, when Dort pulled out of that partnership, and I believe out of the game entirely, Gray wasn't able to continue going, and they did eventually have to close their doors as well. The McLaughlin name continued onwards, helping to form the GM brand that we know and love today. Waterous also flourished into a contemporary company, though they are now based out of the United States, and they've kind of shifted their focus from firefighting vehicles to various kinds of industrial equipment. An interesting fact about that company that I really like is that for the first 77 years, the president of the company was a member of the Waterous family. Not the same member, but a member. It was founded in 1886, but it wasn't until 1963 that somebody outside of that family headed that company. I thought that was really cool. And other carriage manufacturers, they survived to the present day not due to their foray into automobiles, but as an educational facet of history. The Campbell Carriage Factory in Middle Sackville, New Brunswick, was originally opened as a tannery in 1841. In 1855, it was sold to the Campbells, who used the space to build carriages. The carriage factory closed in 1949, but as recently as 2003 opened up as a museum. It's been listed on Canada's Historic Place Register since 2006. So while the arrival of the automobile in Canada did certainly disrupt the carriage manufacturing business and did close a few doors, that's not the end. Horse-drawn transportation has a legacy in Canada and in contemporary vehicles. This legacy, it does include companies like McLaughlin, who helped to build brand names that we have today. But if we pivot slightly, going back to focusing more on the carriages themselves, you can also see elements of this legacy in some familiar features. The first one is what I would argue is the most important safety feature of a modern car, the braking system. So in the example I have here, you press down on the pedal protruding in front of the driver, and the connected lever would push the corresponding brake pad equivalency against the rim of the back tire to start slowing its speed. Now, I've included kind of a foot-operated braking system because that's what's most similar to what we use today. But sometimes the type of brake could be connected to a pole that the driver could push or pull, and it would have the same effect. Now, I'd like to mention this is not the only kind of brake system that some horse-drawn transportation had. I've seen examples where it's actually a drum brake with a constricting band that does kind of the same thing, only it provides friction around the hub. But again, this seemed like the most similar to what we use today. Our next example is a jump seat. And some of you may have used a jump seat before. I have in an old truck my parents had when I was a kid. Some horse-drawn vehicles had them as well. The one that I'm demonstrating in this video can be folded down into a bench seat or folded back up to create a narrower bench that creates kind of like a division between the driver and the passengers. I personally don't think this looks very comfortable to use, especially for long periods of time. But I also didn't really enjoy the jump seats in my parents' truck, so maybe it's just me. Removable seats. Those were also a feature in some horse-drawn vehicles, much as they are, a feature in some vehicles today. In this photograph, my lovely colleague is removing one of the optional seats in a bobsleigh replica that we currently have on display. Removing seats like this back in the day was handy for much of the same reasons we do it today. When you have more cargo than people to move, having floor space over seating is usually pretty helpful. The next one is trunks or boots or storage space. So some horse-drawn vehicles did include built-in compartments for storage, but I wouldn't say it was a standard addition like you see in contemporary cars. Calling it a boot was also fairly common, so much so that it was actually incorporated into the name of some carriages. The two examples that I have here are a panel boot Victoria carriage versus the skeleton boot Victoria carriage. The compartments on these vehicles were actually underneath the driver's seat, and it is very hard, as it turns out, to take a picture underneath the panel of a panel boot Victoria while trying to maintain good lighting and take a photo one-handed. So I do apologize a little bit for the quality of that photo. But these compartments were underneath the driver's seat, usually covered by a panel of some kind, and commonly used as storage space. The skeleton boot, on the other hand, the one on the left-hand side, there was usually no enclosed space underneath these seats. It also sometimes meant that the driver's seat could actually be removed, allowing for the owner to drive it from his seat, or for a coachman to drive it from the back of one of the horses. Sometimes, though, the boot was located in the back of the carriage, much like we would expect to see it on vehicles today. Okay, one of my personal favorites is the convertible top. Absolutely, folding tops did exist on carriages at the turn of the century. Not all carriages, mind you, but definitely ones like this Landau. In the top archival photo, you can see Alberta's first Lieutenant Governor, George Headley Vickers Bullia, sitting inside of an open-air carriage while on his way to the opening of a new Hudson's Bay store in Calgary. It may be a little bit hard to see in black and white, but there is a bit of a bulky mass behind the Lieutenant Governor. That's actually the back half of the carriage's roof and its side walls that have folded back behind the seat. The front wall and the front half also fold back behind the driver. In the photograph below that, which is in color, so hopefully a little bit better to see, you can actually see Bullia's Landau in our collection. It's currently on display in our storage gallery, and its top is fully up. And maybe it's not as clean as some of the convertibles we see today, where the top folds all the way back and tucks into a compartment behind the passengers. But eventually, this feature, it must have been improved upon and innovated. So dashboards, they look a little different today than they did on the carriages in the yesteryears. So today, the dashboard houses things like radios, speedometers, glove boxes, etc., etc. Horse-drawn transportation didn't really have things like that, but their dashboards did often hold things like whip holders, which were little cylindrical containers that the handle of the whip could be inserted into, so the driver didn't have to hold it when it wasn't in use. You can see one just kind of peeking around the edge of this dashboard in the photo there. In more rustic vehicles, these would usually be absent. Dashes like this, though, would also often lend a little bit of protection from debris or mud potentially being kicked up by the horses in front of them. So they were quite handy to have. Speaking of protection from debris, mud guards may be another slightly familiar feature. Most contemporary vehicle bodies are built so that the wheels don't stick out too much. They're inset into wheel wells. In most carriages, however, and many early types of automobiles, the body is built to sit in between the wheels. Mudguards like this were a solution to the wheels kicking up mud and other unsavory material from the road onto the passengers. So another personal favorite of mine are flip seats. And I had a video that I wanted to show you guys of these flip seats actually in action, but for some reason I couldn't get it to play while the slideshow was playing, so I do apologize for that. Just come on by and I'll give you a demonstration next time you're in town. This kind of seat was common on vehicles called traps, which is a completely legitimate carriage term, I promise you, and it is not as intimidating as it sounds. On this particular trap, not only do both of the front seats swing forward like that, the back seat is also specially hinged so that it can face the other way around. So the passengers can sit dos-a-dos or back to back. These are only some carriage features that may have a striking resemblance to some contemporary vehicles, or even automobiles from the past decades, but I can't speak too much on those since they're a little bit outside my wheelhouse. That pun was totally intended. But what features like these flip seats, dashboards, convertible tops demonstrate is that desirable facets of carriage design were built upon and innovated over generations. My academic background is in social and cultural anthropology, which reminds us that our area of study shouldn't be removed from its context, or else our understanding of a situation will be inaccurate. Context, it's not just physical, it's not just the setting, it's also chronological. Horse-drawn transportation is an important aspect of vehicular and technological process that we really can't forget. So, in conclusion, the extant examples that we have of horse-drawn transportation demonstrate a wide range of vehicle use, from private to commercial, industrial, tourism, and lots of other things in between. There was so much variety and variety in design and in function that really is truly so inspiring to see. And some of those carriages were definitely intended to be seen. Again, that cigar wagon, amazing. Horse-drawn vehicles were integral proponents of Canadian society, not only because of the physical roles they fulfilled, but because they were considered indicators of wealth, status, class, the lack of that. I haven't outright stated it before now, but I think that many people may have been picking up over the last 45 minutes or so how a lot of these assertions sound really similar to how we regard our vehicles today. We still regard some types of cars or trucks as luxury brands that signal some sort of status, perhaps, or others that suggest a certain type of occupation. And we still utilize both specialized and general type vehicles to handle a huge variety of jobs, like that smart car truck example at the very beginning of the talk. Horse-drawn transportation was absolutely just as fundamental to our society then as automobiles are today. Not only because they allowed us to work, communicate, and travel more efficiently, but because they also helped to form the foundation upon which our advancement has grown for the past 100 years or more. They may have been a stepping stone, but they're an important one. So that concludes my presentation portion of today's talk. Thank you so much for your attention, and in advance for any questions that you may have for me. If you would prefer to reach out directly, my email address is ashley.hardwick@gov.eb.ca.
Oh, thanks so much, Ashley.
Thank you.
Just going through the Q&A, I guess I'll start us off here. I'll put up our fancy end slide that we had going. But to start us off, do you have a sense of, you were talking about how important carriages are for general transportation. How widespread was the ownership of a horse-drawn vehicle? Was it, was there a carriage in every driveway, as it were?
Not necessarily. There were, especially in city centers, right? There were more hack vehicles available for rent, jaunting cars, hack passenger wagons, which were kind of an earlier iteration of stagecoaches, where you would hire it, pay a fare to go from one place to the other. If you had the resources to be able to have a carriage, usually you would have one. It does also depend on what the vehicle was, what was the vehicle intended to do, right? If you were a rancher or a farmer, chances are you had a grain wagon or something along those lines that would help you with your occupation. If you were just using it for, everyday use, back and forth transportation, well, maybe not so much. Hope that answered your question.
It does. We've had a question from Mike about going back to sort of the evolution of features like brake pedals and dashboards. Can you talk anything about carriage lamps and how they eventually found their way onto automobiles, maybe?
Okay, so not really. Mostly because I'm not as familiar with the automobile side of things. What I can tell you is that there was a bit of a transition period between carriages and automobiles. We've got one on display right now. Unfortunately, I didn't get a photo of it before now, where they are literally horseless carriages. In my opinion, they can be quite ugly looking too, but it probably would have just been, that natural evolution of, oh, we're traveling in the dark, we need to see. It wouldn't have been necessarily candle or oil lamps, especially once they started getting batteries and hand crank and whatnot, but I could just see common sense there. We need light, lamps.
It's a topic we're in the process of researching an exhibit on, and certainly it seems to have been in the very earliest car headlights were, or what would become headlights, were an extension of how they were on carriages. It was something to allow you to see the inside of your vehicle, and mostly so that pedestrians could see you, but not the other way around. The impression we've gotten was that, the horse will find the way. A horse has better eyesight than the driver. It knows where it's going, but you don't want to accidentally run over a pedestrian, so you might as well be lit up.
That's true too, and especially when you're in places that have hilly terrain or lots of trees and you can't exactly see what's coming around the other side of the corner, having lanterns alerts other people on the other side that you're coming. This is actually very similar to a lot of winter vehicles had shaft bells or saddle bells, stuff like that sounded really pretty, but they were also practical because it told people around you that you're there, you're moving, and to watch out, basically.
We've got tons of questions. My goodness, there's some wonderful ones coming in.
Perfect.
Raj is wondering what kind of long distance travel did people do? Were carriages mostly used for, a trip down the block, or were we doing, massive interprovincial cross province kind of trips?
Absolutely, there are vehicles for both. Stagecoaches, we've got one on display right now it's not between provinces, this specific example, but I'm sure there were some that were used between provinces. But again, from Edmonton all the way down to Calgary, that was a 14-day round trip. And so what you would do is it's much the same as buying a plane ticket today. You would purchase your fare, you would get on this, and eventually a few days later you would end up in another city or another province. Smaller carriages that were, not pulled by oxen or 16 horses or 12 horses, however many, probably couldn't do that same distance. And then you wouldn't want a really fancy carriage going over the terrain that you get in the Canadian prairies. So you would want something a little bit more robust, right? If that makes sense.
So combining, I'm rolling some questions together from Julia and from Larry. Do we know who was the largest Canadian carriage manufacturer? And do you have a sense of sort of annual production numbers? Like, are we talking hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of carriages made here?
Oh, goodness.
I know McLaughlin always claimed they were the biggest carriage manufacturer in the British Empire, but I've never really seen many hard stats to back that up.
Yes, unfortunately, when it comes to hard stats, a lot of those records have been lost. Archival material is one of the first things to be lost to the sands of time. But McLaughlin was one of the bigger ones, and I do know, just based on some of the research that I've done, that quite a few carriage companies, especially the bigger ones, especially the ones that took on the American method, if you will, of all the wheels were made here, and then all of the bodies were made here, and all the embroidery was done here, that could create carriages in a matter of minutes. They were turning out quite a few carriages, thousands a year.
And how often were these vehicles made to order versus being, you select your, was there a Sears catalog for carriages? Did you select your, 1895 coupe model and go for it?
Absolutely. I love looking through carriage catalogs. Yes, absolutely. So you could get add-ons or better textiles or a different type of spring, for example, depending on who you were working with and what vehicle you were looking to purchase. Well, if you were buying used, you might not have that much flexibility, but you could always purchase to order, or order to purchase, sorry.
Phil's asking how common, in the realm of public transit, how common, he's asking about horse-drawn streetcars, but let's expand that to, horse-drawn buses and things. How common was that both in Canada and being made in Canada?
That is a really excellent question that maybe they should reach out to me and I can look into more detail for them.
Certainly, I know through my own research, Ottawa had a large horse-drawn streetcar network in the 1880s, but I don't know if they were Canadian made. It is a good question.
We have one in our outreach vehicle collection that was made specifically for us, and it was used in Cardston as part of the museum offering. But I'm not very up to date on public transit in that way, anyway.
We've had a couple questions. Would you be able to give us sort of a general history of the Carriage Museum and where its collection came from?
My Carriage Museum?
Yeah, yours.
Oh, absolutely I can. So the Remington Carriage Museum was kind of formed in partnership between Don Remington and the Alberta government. So Mr. Remington had actually had a few, I don't know that I'd call them stipulations, but he was willing to donate his entire collection of vehicles, which was at the time, I believe our core collection was 46 horse-drawn vehicles that he personally curated. And in some cases, he actually restored a few. So he was willing to donate that to the Alberta government if they would build a museum for it in Cardston. And it had to be a working history museum. So our restoration shop and our barn, we do, and when the weather is nice, we do carriage rides outside as well. And you can talk to our stable supervisor and our drivers about our care and how we take care of our horses and what goes into basically having them up to drive carriages. And the Alberta government went essentially, cool, we'll do it, and we'll do you one better. We will send almost all of the horse-drawn vehicles in the provincial collection to this new museum. So the core of our collection was from Don Remington. A lot of it came from our sister sites around the province. And then we're always getting new donations as well.
Excellent. Marion's asking about sleighs, which we've touched on a little bit, but I feel like we could do an entire second seminar on sleighs in Canada. But can you speak a bit to Canadian sleigh manufacturing?
So when it came to sleigh manufacturing, actually a lot of wheeled vehicle manufacturers also did sleighs. So I believe McLaughlin, we had, like I said, we've got that exhibit on him. I'd say, you know, a good half of the vehicles we have on display from McLaughlin are cutters or sleighs. A cutter is basically a smaller 1 or 2 person sleigh. So yeah, basically, especially in Canada where we get a lot of snow, most horse-drawn vehicle manufacturers that I know of also produce sleighs, cutters, bobsleighs, the whole nine.
Great. I think we'd have about a minute left here before 8 o'clock. It's really flown by. With a few questions. We'll follow up with all of our inquiries. But Derek, do you want to choose a kind of a last question?
I have a perfect wrap-up question. Genevieve is asking if you could give us the name of that definitive reference book on carriage terminology.
Yes, my absolute favorite that I reference all the time. It is Carriage Terminology and Historical Dictionary by Don H. Berkebile.
Excellent. Thank you. And Ashley, do you have any last comments? I know whenever I give a talk, there's always something at the end. I think, oh, I want to mention this interesting thing that popped into my head. Any last comments on carriages or a fun anecdote about horses?
Well, one thing that did kind of pop into my head that I wasn't sure if I should mention when I was asked about the history of my museum is that unfortunately Mr. Remington died, I think, a year or 2 before the museum opened. But I really think that he'd be pretty proud with what we're doing with it today. So other than that, I had so much fun being here tonight. I hope I answered everybody's questions satisfactory. But if I didn't, please email me. That's what I'm here for.